Sam Seder, Emma Vigland on the Majority Report. Pleasure to welcome to the program Alberto Medina, writer, editor, advocate for Puerto Rico's decolonization and independence, and the publisher of Free Puerto Rico on Substack. Alberto, welcome to the program.
Thank you so much for having me, Sam and Emma. Great to be here.
Want to get to the question of Puerto Rican independence, which is, sort of like always in the background as people start to talk about what the Democrats, if they get back into power and if they decide to exercise that power, how can they build on that power? Puerto Rican statehood is often mentioned within a series of different things they can do. But before we get there, I guess it was about 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump essentially fired 5 of the 7 members of Puerto Rico's Financial Oversight and Management Board. Let's talk about first what this board was. I mean, there's sort of like a frying pan to the fire type of quality of this. And also, it seems to me, it's another example of a structure that is put in place by Obama and where you would say, well, this is bad, but also contemplate, like, what if it's not Obama as president? Like, just hypothetically, what if it was someone crazy like Donald Trump? I mean, this is where we're at now, but walk us through, what is the FOMB?
Yeah. So just to give people a little bit of background on why this even came to be and why it's happening, Puerto Rico has been financially and economically vulnerable for a very long time. It got battered by the Great Recession, and about 10 years ago, it reached a point where it had accumulated about $70 billion in public debt. The government of Puerto Rico declared that debt was unpayable. Problem was, Puerto Rico is not a sovereign nation, of course, so it couldn't sort of avail itself of those structures to restructure its debt. And Congress had actually, declared decades ago, for reasons we can only guess at, that Puerto Rico could also not enter bankruptcy, could not enter Chapter 9 bankruptcy as U.S. municipalities can. So it had to do something, right? Because Puerto Rico had no legal way to restructure its debt. The Puerto Rican legislature actually tried, it actually passed a law to create sort of a debt restructuring process for itself. And the federal court struck it down because it said the federal bankruptcy code was what applied, and the federal bankruptcy code did not allow Puerto Rico to do this. So Congress gets involved, Congress legislates, it passes this law, Promesa, signed by President Obama.
I'm sorry, can I just add, just for people who don't know, what bankruptcy would do at that point for the country, what's done for New York City declared bankruptcy back in the 70s. It allows the debtor, in this instance, Puerto Rico, to restructure its debt and essentially pay back creditors like, a fraction of what they owe, and allow themselves to get that type of relief so they have room to make investments and they can actually pay, to attempt to build themselves out. So by stripping the Puerto Rico of the ability, or I should say, fundamentally denying the ability of Puerto Rico to declare bankruptcy, you are denying them any type of autonomy, which is available to other entities, whether it's corporate or individuals or cities or municipalities, to restructure their debt, which is like a fundamental building block of finance.
That's right. And, that would have been a painful process for Puerto Rico, certainly, but it would have been much better than what ended up happening, which is Congress passes this law, Promesa, signed by President Obama in 2016, which creates a debt restructuring process for Puerto Rico, but it creates the Financial Oversight and Management Board, which Puerto Ricans not very lovingly call La Junta. It's a board of 7 unelected members appointed by the President of the United States that are given the power to oversee this debt restructuring process, but are actually given sort of awesome, almost unlimited power over Puerto Rico. Whenever Puerto Rico's legislature passes a law now, they have to basically submit a memo to the board on what the fiscal impact of that law will be. And if the board decides that it doesn't like it, that it doesn't fit into its vision for Puerto Rico's finances, it can strike down a law passed by Puerto Rico's elected legislators. So, it's a very colonial, imperialist entity that on top of that has basically, tried to restructure the debt by implementing massive austerity on Puerto Rico, by slashing pensions, by cutting funding for public education, for all kinds of public services. And that's what it's done for basically the past 10 years. So with good reasons, most Puerto Ricans do not like the board. But as you say, it is a frying pan into the fire situation now, because Donald Trump has not eliminated the board. He has merely fired most of its members. He actually fired a sixth member since I wrote that piece. So there's now only one of 7 members on the board. He fired initially all the Democrats. He did fire one Republican who had been appointed by President Obama and had been there since the beginning. So this happens 2 weeks ago. It happens after a kind of pressure campaign from Laura Loomer and other ultra conservative. And
she's the main character in every story now and is dictating large swaths of U.S. policy. We just opened the show with the fact that her tweet about Palestinian children and Heal Palestine is basically now being translated into the State Department pulling visas for kids with no limbs.
Yeah, it seems as though she's running the government, and these board members were sort of her latest victims. And one asks themselves why, right? Why does Laura Loomer suddenly care about Puerto Rico's finances? And, I think the answer is that the vulture funds, the hedge funds who bought a lot of Puerto Rico's debt, who have had it and who have been fighting, Puerto Rico and the board in court for years now, and often losing, because even though they've been profiting massively off of, this debt restructuring process, they want to profit even more, because of course they do. They sort of figured out a way to get some pressure going, get some of these board members out of the way, and the expectation is that the new members who will be appointed by President Trump, and the president appoints these members based on lists of recommendations from mostly the majority in Congress, will be ultra friendly to the bondholders, ultra friendly to these hedge funds, and will implement more austerity and continue to hurt the Puerto Rican people.
I want to get into that, and I want to also get into like the sort of the sort of the crypto element to this as well. But I want to just stay at Laura Loomer for 1 second. I understand, like, the idea of Laura Loomer acting as a conduit for these people, and the chances of like, Laura Loomer's being sponsored by these bondholders or whatever. I mean, that to me, like, she's functioning like a lobbyist, I guess, on some level, or maybe she isn't, maybe it's not. I'm just like, I can understand that type of dynamic would make sense to me. People who are always in the orbit of the president end up getting approached, whether, whoever it is, and, represent my interests. What I find fascinating is that why is she an effective conduit? It just seems, and I know you're not in a position to know that any more than I don't know, maybe even Trump's chief of staff has any clue as to this. But what is it? Is it just the bondholders? Is it like, who are the financial interests that have been in any way squelched by the FOMB? What is left? I'm trying to think of like what scenario where it's just sort of like you would put an edict out there, like, every dollar needs to be repaid, but $1.25 per dollar, or I'm trying to figure out what more can these people get, and who who these people are has changed slightly. I know there has been a lot more crypto sort of investment in Puerto Rico over the past half a dozen years or so.
Yeah, and the crypto piece is largely kind of a separate thing of some tax incentives that Puerto Rico passed that attracted a lot of these investors and ultra rich people to move to the island, which is a whole kind of other conversation about the gentrification and displacement. These people buy up sometimes entire city blocks to turn them into Airbnbs. So that's certainly a problem. In terms of the debt, it is a lot of hedge funds like Golden Tree Asset Management that has been especially active in fighting, as I said, Puerto Rico and the board in court. The biggest piece that they're focused on right now is outstanding debt from PREPA, which was Puerto Rico's public power utility before it was privatized, essentially because the board forced its privatization as part of its new fiscal reality for Puerto Rico that it wanted to impose. And the fight really there is that the bondholders want the power bills in Puerto Rico to increase even more. Puerto Rico already pays one of the highest rates, certainly in the United States, perhaps in the world for electricity. They just want to increase the power bill on Puerto Ricans who 40% live under the poverty line, including 60% of Puerto Rican children. Let's raise their power bill even more so that we can get more money in the coffer so that bondholders can get paid even more. This is sort of the biggest fight right now. It's a fight that they were, again, kind of losing in court. So I think they figured, well, if we can't convince the federal judge who's in charge of Puerto Rico's debt restructuring process to approve this deal, let's get rid of these board members, these commissioners, right? I mean, the board right now doesn't even have quorum for any kinds of negotiations. The federal judge already had to delay a series of deadlines that were coming up in these debt court cases because the board can't operate right now. So I think this is what Trump and Loomer or really the people behind them, because I don't think either Trump or Loomer really much know or care exactly what happens in Puerto Rico. But they're useful instruments for these folks who they don't want just 60 cents, 70 cents on the dollar on bonds that they bought, a lot of times knowing that it was junk, right? But I think they foresaw that they were going to be able to profit from it, and that's what they're trying to do right now.
Well, I'm just fascinated by just the money piece of this. If we could stay for a second, your article cites that McKinsey has made over $100 million or something like that, consulting on the debt restructuring. And then you have these members of the board who were appointed by Obama, and it seems like the austerity agenda was going quite well based on its stated terms. What are even the obstacles that the Trump administration is concerned about? Because look, it looks like the people in Puerto Rico are being immiserated. They don't have their sovereignty. People are getting rich. What more do they want is the question that I'm asking.
Yeah, and I think they want more of their money back on these bonds that they bought, and it's certainly true that the board has been a real moneymaker for lawyers, for consultants. The board members themselves don't have a salary, but the staff of the board, including its executive director, who, as I mentioned in the article, right now is Robert Mujica, who was Andrew Cuomo's budget chief in New York when Cuomo was governor. He makes $625,000 a year as the executive director of the Financial Oversight Board. That's a higher salary than the President of the United States. And there's a staff that is obviously getting paid, and then there's this army of lawyers and consultants that they've used over the past decade. The estimates I've seen put the costs of the board at $2 billion over the last 10 years. And this is all getting paid for by Puerto Ricans. So even though the law and the board was established by Congress, Puerto Rico foots the bill for all of the costs associated with the oversight board. So it's a particularly cruel insult to injury that even as it is eviscerating Puerto Rican society, we also have to pay for them doing it.
I just want to explain to people about this issue about the bonds, because when people hear oh, they're getting 70 cents return on their dollar, the whole, if I am not mistaken, Puerto Rican bonds, I'm thinking now 10, 15 years ago, were returning north of 10% in terms of dividends, maybe up to 15%. They were very, very lucrative. And they also completely tax-free, because they're outside of any bounds of a state or municipality. So you're getting these massive returns. And the risk associated with them is that, that's why you're theoretically getting those returns. And a savvy investor knows that. And what they're trying to do is change essentially the rules of the game, which is you get big returns for a high risk thing. And now what they're trying to do is completely eliminate the risk by taking over the entities and extracting the money, their returns, from the average Puerto Rican.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, Puerto Rico's bonds have always been a huge, huge moneymaker. They are triple tax exempt. This is another decision that Congress made back in the day, supposedly, right, to foster investment in Puerto Rico and to allow Puerto Rico to use this as a tool for economic development. Of course, that is part of what led to this $70 billion debt trap that Puerto Rico found itself in. But it's really, it all comes down to Congress and the U.S. government getting to make the rules, right, when it comes to Puerto Rico, and the folks who know how to move pieces within the U.S. government, whether that's through Laura Loomer or that's through legislation. They get to use those rules to their advantage. So when we talk about Puerto Rico being a colony, this is what colonies are for, right? It's for economic exploitation. It's not going to look like gold and silver mines like it used to in the 18th and 19th century, right? This is what colonialism looks like in Puerto Rico in the 21st century. It's bonds, it's the Jones Act,
finance,
it's all
right.
of these. Yeah, it's all of these sometimes kind of bureaucratic, technocratic things that are hard to wrap your head around, and you got to keep a lot of numbers in your head. But this is how Puerto Rico is abused and exploited in 2025.
So the sort of I guess the natural next question is like, how does Puerto Rico get out from under this lack of autonomy and get the rights for some type of autonomy or self-determination? Some people suggest statehood. Then there's some representation for Puerto Rico. You had a piece sort of delineating the difference between the question of statehood for Washington, D.C., which is now being occupied by essentially federal militia. I don't know what else to call them. And in Puerto Rico, address that. And maybe we should start just like with sort of the polling, because to the extent that we have a sense of what the Puerto Ricans feel about this, it's difficult to really assess. I mean, I think that sort of broadly speaking, there is an inclination towards statehood, but it's not as strong and obvious, I think, as some of the polling, or you would suggest that some of the polling shows.
Yeah. And, this has been a very difficult and very complicated question for a long time. Puerto Rico has voted 7 times on its political status, going back to 1967, all of these non-binding votes with, different kinds of ballot designs and questions and boycotts, especially in recent years. And we have seen a huge change, especially in the last few years, as Puerto Rico's crises have intensified. So in 2024, in last year's election, there was another one of these votes, and statehood did get 59% of the vote, but independence and sovereign free association, which is a form of independence in which Puerto Rico would then negotiate a bilateral compact with the United States. So those two sovereign options combined for 42% of the vote, which is a dramatic increase from the kind of single-digit support that independence would get in these elections previously. And I should note that those numbers are only the numbers if you do not count the hundreds of thousands of blank ballots and spoiled ballots from people who just objected to this process, who sort of as a protest vote left the ballot blank, or sometimes wrote Free Palestine on the ballot, or Free Puerto Rico. So that's kind of where we are right now. The independence movement has been growing by leaps and bounds. I think in part.
So let me just ask you one question on that. So because that's a weird way of tabulating this. Like if you have 100% of the vote, and let's say 25% of the vote is the ballots left blank, it's you can't then just take the remaining 75% and assess and pretend that's the 100%, right? I mean, that's what was done there. That's not how most sort of like things are done. It would be, maybe it got a plurality, but it didn't necessarily get a majority.
That's right. And actually, if you account for the blank ballots, statehood got under 50%. I believe it was 48, 49%. And this is what's happened with these votes, because, a lot of Puerto Ricans think of them as a joke now. Again, there's been 7 of them. None of them have been considered, treated as binding by Congress. Congress has ignored the results. I mean, statehood got 59%, by some accounts, right? Last year. Who's talking about statehood right now in the U.S. or about actually doing this or listening to the will of the Puerto Rican people, as it's often put? It's not happening at all because I think most people understand the political reality, that it just can't happen in Congress, that it can't get 60 votes in the Senate. Just as, statehood for Washington, D.C. can't. I think, if anything, D.C. statehood is slightly more likely than Puerto Rican statehood, but not likely at all. And that's been the case for a long time. We've seen it in recent years when there has been some legislation that either never even makes it out of committee or, certainly doesn't make it to the Senate. So, I think this is what people need to understand about the question of Puerto Rico status. And I think, progressive have especially have had a little bit of a blind spot here and have often said one of two things. Either it's not our place to take a position. This is up to Puerto Ricans. They should decide, and whatever they want, we'll do. But of course, that's not true because it's all up to Congress and what can pass in Congress. So I think what that does is sort of perpetuate the colonial status because it doesn't address the fundamental reality that Congress is in charge of Puerto Rico, including of Puerto Rico's political fate. Or they'll sort of, do this push for statehood, which again does not address the reality that, to my mind, and I think to most people who think about it for a couple of minutes, like there's no way to get to 60 votes in the Senate for Puerto Rico statehood. But also on a political, ideological level, especially for progressives and folks on the left. And it's really fitting, I think, to be having this conversation after a conversation about Ukraine. When it comes to something like Ukraine, I think we understand very well the need to preserve national sovereignty, right? And I think we understand that it would be an injustice if Russia just finished invading Ukraine and then, added it to the Russian Federation and gave it all of its voting rights and all of its representation. I don't believe that would be a just and decolonial outcome for Ukraine. Well, I don't think statehood is a just and decolonial outcome for Puerto Rico because it would mean that the United States got to invade a nation as it did in 1898, keep it as a possession for 125 plus years at this point, and then permanently annex it and keep it forever. And I think that's at the heart of the difference between the DC and Puerto Rico statehood questions. DC is an American city of, Americans who, by a constitutional quirk, really, don't have full political rights and representation. Puerto Rico is a nation, a Latin American and Caribbean nation that was invaded and occupied by the United States, has been kept as a possession, as a colony. And I think if you invade a place, the right thing to do is
for independence. I mean, if statehood needs 60 votes in the Senate, is there a mechanism? What would be the mechanism for Puerto Rican sovereignty?
Yeah, and I think there's a couple of different ways that it could happen. Probably the easiest and most realistic way is through an act of Congress, because again, legally, Congress has full authority over Puerto Rico under the territorial clause of the Constitution. The UN could certainly get involved, and for the last 40 years, the United Nations has passed, at least the Special Decolonization Committee of the United Nations has passed resolutions affirming Puerto Rico's right to decolonization and independence. That has not sort of made it to the General Assembly or really had much impact, and I think most of us know the challenge of getting the UN to have any real impact on some of these issues. But that is certainly, another possibility. Puerto Rico could establish its own sort of status convention or kind of a constitutional convention-like body and, come to the determination of, we've decided we want sovereignty. That's our demand. Take that demand to Congress. I still think that would have to end up in some legislation, but the push could come that way from the Puerto Rican people. But many of us and the work that I and my organization do in Congress especially is recognizing that Congress has a huge role to play here, and that it actually is easier to get to 60 votes for independence, I believe, than to statehood, because even if it is for frankly, racist and unjust reasons, there are many Republicans who would support Puerto Rico's independence because it means hey, we don't have this threat of statehood and new Democratic senators, and we don't have to keep sending tens of billions of dollars a year to these poor brown people in the Caribbean. We're not going to have 3 million new Latino voters, as which is what statehood would mean, right? I mean, think about where the country is right now. Think about especially the anti-Latino politics that are at the heart of politics in the United States, arguably for a very long time, but especially right now. Does statehood really seem like political possibility in the near or medium term? I certainly don't think so. And as long as we keep pretending that it might be, just because it might sound good to say like, oh, let's give Puerto Ricans equal rights, the kind of colonial status that allows Trump to now take over Puerto Rico essentially through this port firing will continue.
Well, I mean, I think we all have to wait for Laura Loomer to weigh in on this question if we really want any type of resolution. Alberto, Medina, we will link to your Substack, Free Puerto Rico, as well as your piece in the Jacobin on the Trump's hostile takeover of the island, and specifically in terms of like the finances on the Financial Oversight and Management Board. Really appreciate your time today. And again, we'll just keep looking at Laura Loomer's Twitter feed to see what we're all going to be doing over the course of the next months and years. So appreciate your time. Hey, folks, don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our daily show. We do it every day at 12 p.m. Eastern for about 2.5 hours. We even take phone calls. You should check that out.